Hey, everybody, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. We're working through the book of Matthew a little bit every day. Right now, we are on a quick historical detour through the Old Testament to understand, as we get ready to move into the home stretch of Matthew, starting in chapter 24, we're trying to really understand the story of the temple, what it is a metaphor for, what happened to it, the burden that Jesus' original audience, that Matthew's original audience would have carried around in their heart with the story of the temple, the role they would have imagined that the temple played in their lives, that they play in the ongoing story of the temple. It's a big deal. A way bigger deal than your relationship with pretty much probably any building you've ever encountered ever. So we're trying to really understand that before we move forward. And yesterday we started working on the part of the story where the first temple has been destroyed, but there's this indication that something is still coming, that maybe there's going to be another temple. Maybe it's going to be rebuilt somewhere in the 500s BC, and it all revolves around this character named Cyrus. And that's what we're unpacking right now. I'm going to have Jeff play a little bit of music, and we'll pick it up right where we left off last time. So this Cyrus guy comes up actually quite a bit throughout the Old Testament. We just looked at 2 Chronicles. We just looked at Ezra 1, in Jeremiah 25, as well as 29. That's what's being referenced there by Ezra, who's saying like to fulfill what was said by the prophet Jeremiah. But he's also mentioned heavily in the book of Isaiah in chapters 45 and 46. Should have noted that. Nope. Yeah, chapters 44 and 45, excuse me. At the end of chapter 44 in Isaiah, which holds itself out as predating the Persian ascendancy to power, you've got this prediction that is more or less the prophet runs up to it by saying like, oh, God has all this power. He could predict the future. He could do it. He could do it. And there's been so many sad things throughout the book of Isaiah. It's recounting the judgment of God and all of this history, and even pointing a little bit to the future of what it's going to be like between God and Israel, and about how God remembers and how God is calling Israel to remember. Then at the end of 44, excuse me, once again, not the end of 45, we get this gem. I will dry up your streams. Who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd and will accomplish all that I please. He will say of Jerusalem, let it be rebuilt, and of the temple, let its foundation be laid. And then chapter 45 talks a lot more about specifically how that's going to happen with Cyrus, the emperor of the Persians. And again, at the time that this is held out as being predicted, there was no Cyrus. There was no reason to believe that Persia was going to conquer Babylon. This was happening in a different era, so this was a pretty remarkable calling of a shot, if it is rightly to be understood as entirely predictive, and these predictions are to be understood as predating what actually happened here with Cyrus's conquest and this decree to send his people home. Now, you will note, and people have noted, that some of the language early in Isaiah chapter 45 sounds like Cyrus is kind of a picture, an image, a forerunner, a symbol of Christ, and that even some of the same language gets used. This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of to subdue the nations before him. And there is some stuff here that indicates some sort of parallel or word picture that points to Jesus in that narrative bump sense of how the Old Testament story rhymes with the New Testament story, how sometimes the story is fulfilled, not just in a direct, predictive, prophetic way, but there's also language regarding this stuff about Cyrus to indicate that he's not a one-for-one analogy for Jesus. In Isaiah 45:5, it says, I am the Lord and there is no other. We're still talking about Cyrus here. Apart from me, there is no God. I will strengthen you, though you have not acknowledged me. Well, okay, here we're talking clearly about the man Cyrus, who is a guy who God is directing, even though that Cyrus at this point in the narrative has not yet acknowledged him, or maybe never really fully will understand who this God is about. So this can get a little bit confusing because of the order of the Old Testament books. If you just look at the order in which the books are listed, it looks like the history happens first, and then we get the prophecy surrounding it. But that's just because all the history stuff is organized at the beginning of the Old Testament, and then overwhelmingly, once you get past Ezra and Nehemiah and finally Esther, then you get into wisdom language, the Psalms, the major prophets, the minor prophets, and so the chronology gets a little bit confusing. Let me just rearrange it for you real quick in case this is starting to get a little bit goofy. What we have happening is that the prophets Jeremiah and Isaiah are talking about some serious tough times coming, particularly Jeremiah. But both Jeremiah and Isaiah predict that this punishment, this judgment from God at the hands of other great nations will occur, but that there's still a deliverance that's going to happen. Then 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles give us the actual story of how that played out. And sure enough, you were warned. Everything goes terribly wrong, and Nebuchadnezzar conquers the southern kingdom, conquers Jerusalem, topples the temple. That's the end of 2nd Chronicles. And then the historian, the author of 2nd Chronicles, goes on to give us that after credits scene to say, well, then Cyrus did exactly what was predicted earlier by Isaiah the prophet and made this decree. Then we turn the page to the book of Ezra and we get more details. It's like the sequel, the follow-up to that after credits scene in 2nd Chronicles. Then we get more details about Cyrus's decree and what was going on and how the Israelite people responded to that. And what we find out is that a whole bunch of them are like, heck yeah, we're doing this thing. God, in this grand reversal of fortune, showed his blessing to us. We have endured these decades of hardship and difficulty, but he's not given up on his people. He does remember us. There is even still the glimmer of hope that his promises regarding the Messiah and this great lasting kingdom will actually continue and persist. God does keep his promises. And so the Israelite people, they gather the money and the resources with the blessing of Cyrus. And then Ezra gives us a list of the total people from all of these different towns and families who go on this trip cross-country over the period of months back to Jerusalem from what then would have been the Far East in Susa and Persepolis, the capitals of the Persian Empire. Apparently they took about 42,000 people, 42,360 to be precise, and a bunch of servants, and they took some animals and camels, horses, donkeys, and stuff with them, and they arrived in Jerusalem after this brutally long trip. And then Ezra gives us the description of what it's like to put the temple back together, who the people were who started to put the foundation in place. And next time around, what we're going to look at is Ezra chapter 3, and specifically Ezra's account of what it was like when the foundations of the temple, this brand new temple that had to be built to replace the one of Solomon's that got destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. I want to look at the account of what it was like when that happened and how people responded and how it compared. And you've been paying attention to the last few conversations. Should we be expecting the same kind of thing when this temple is done that happened when the tabernacle got set up and God's Spirit supernaturally arrived and consumed the sacrifices and demonstrated like, yep, I am here? And should we be expecting a repeat of that same thing that happened when Solomon's great temple was dedicated, as we looked at in 1 Kings and in 2 Chronicles, and all of this miraculous stuff happens and the cloud appears and it's like God is here and fire is consuming this stuff? Is it going to happen again? Everybody at this point in the story would have been holding their breath to say, it looks like God is behind this. It looks like we're doing what we're supposed to do. Will he still prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that he will dwell among us? How is this new temple going to play out? Again, the reason we're doing all of this in a podcast where we're working our way through the book of Matthew is because so much of where the story goes from Matthew 24 on to the end of the chapter has to do with the story you and I are working on right now. That is the temple, what it is, where it came from, what it meant to people. And specifically what we're trying to get really nailed down is how people in the original audience for Matthew would have viewed themselves as individuals, as a religious community, as a political community, as players and participants in this unfolding story of the relationship between God and his chosen people, with the temple being a primary metaphor for what that precious relationship through the centuries had been about, and with that temple being a primary metaphor for what they could be looking forward to in terms of what God would do next. This is very important stuff. I'm super glad that it's worked out for us to go way down the rabbit hole on this and dig into it. I mean, hey, why not now? I'm having fun. So thank you for engaging this with me. And also thanks to everybody who's supporting the program at patreon.com/the TMBH That's the reason we get to do this together. So y'all are awesome. Thanks for the help with that. All right, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.